There's a story you've been telling, not to other people, to yourself. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like self-awareness. It sounds actually like the voice of someone who has done real work on herself, someone who understands her own life, who has earned the right to explain things the way she explains them. The story goes something like this. The timing wasn't right. The circumstances were complicated. The people around her weren't ready. There was too much happening. There wasn't enough support. The conditions were never quite what they needed to be. And all of those things were probably true. The details in the story are real. The pain in it is real. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Not, is the story true? But what does the story protect you from having to face? Psychology has a name for what happens when the mind needs a particular conclusion to be true. It's called motivated reasoning. And it works like this. The mind doesn't start with evidence and arrive at a conclusion. It starts with the conclusion, the one it needs to reach, and then goes looking for evidence to support it. Not consciously, not deliberately, not with any intention to deceive, but systematically, efficiently, and with extraordinary skill. When the conclusion the mind needs is, I can't change yet, it finds every real piece of evidence that confirms this. The difficult relationship, the unsupportive environment, the financial pressure, the exhaustion, the timing, all real, all selected. Because the alternative, I could change and I'm choosing not to, is a much more uncomfortable sentence to live with. And here is the question that psychology keeps circling back to, the one that is almost impossible to ask yourself honestly. What would have to be true about you if the circumstances were no longer the reason? Not about the circumstances, about you. What would you have to look at? What would you have to change? What would you have to give up? Not of the circumstances, but of the story itself. Because the story isn't just an explanation. The story is a shelter. And dismantling a shelter, even one that has become too small, even one that is no longer protecting you from anything real, requires something the circumstances never asked of you. Stay with me here. There's something that the research on self-deception reveals that most people find deeply uncomfortable. The most sophisticated stories we tell ourselves are not made of lies. They are made of truth, carefully selected, strategically arranged, internally consistent truth. Clinical psychologist Dr. Courtney Warren spent years studying this. She found that the stories people build to stay where they are, the ones that feel like honesty, that feel like self-awareness, that feel like someone who has really examined her life, are almost indistinguishable from the inside from genuine clarity, because they use real material. The timing was difficult. That's true. The circumstances were hard. That's true. The people around you weren't supportive. That may well be true, but here's what the research asks you to consider. Difficult circumstances are the context in which every meaningful change has ever happened. Not in spite of them. Inside them, the women who move their lives. Not the dramatic cinematic version, but the real, quiet, unwitnessed version, did not wait for better circumstances. They changed while the circumstances were exactly as hard as yours. And I know how that sounds. I know it can feel like someone is minimizing what you've been through. That's not what this is. What this is a question about the invisible structure underneath the story. Not why haven't you changed yet? But when did you first learn that waiting was safer than moving? What happened specifically? At some point in your history that taught you that the conditions needed to be right before you were allowed to begin. Because that lesson came from somewhere. It didn't arrive as a belief. It arrived as an experience. And an experience repeated enough times becomes a rule. And a rule, operating invisibly, becomes a story about why the timing is never quite right. And a story, believed completely, becomes the thing you call reality. I've caught myself in this, not as a concept, as a lived pattern. There were years when my story was airtight. Every element of it was true. Every obstacle I named was real. I was not lying to myself. But I was also not asking the harder question. What was the story protecting me from? And the answer, when I finally stopped defending the story long enough to look, was not the circumstances. It was a belief, much older than the circumstances, about what I was allowed to want, and whether I was the kind of person who got to have it. The circumstances had been the evidence. But the conclusion had already been written. Long before any of it happened. Stay with me, because this is the part that changes something. The story you've built is not a prison you were put in. It is a shelter you built, with your own hands, from real materials, for real reasons. And the question is not whether the shelter was necessary when you built it. It probably was. The question is whether you still need it now, or whether you've been living inside it long past the moment the danger passed. And you cannot answer that question by examining the shelter. You can only answer it by asking what you were afraid of when you built it. What were you protecting yourself from? What would have happened in your history, in your original learning, if you had moved before the conditions were right? What was the cost of acting before you were certain? Because somewhere in you, there is a very old answer to that question. And that answer has been writing your story ever since. But I want to go one layer deeper here. Because most women, when they first hear this, feel a flash of recognition and then immediately reach for the next layer of story. Yes, but my situation really is more complicated. Yes, but the people in my life really don't support this. Yes, but I've already tried and it didn't work. And I'm not dismissing any of that. What I'm pointing to is the speed of it. Notice how quickly the new layer of story arrives. Notice how ready it was. Notice how much it sounds like the first one, careful, reasonable, assembled from real details. That speed is not a sign that the new story is wrong. It is a sign that the shelter is well built. It has been reinforced over many years. It knows how to respond to threats. It knows how to present itself as clarity. And the question beneath the question isn't whether the stories are true. It's what is inside the shelter that needs this much protection? What is it that you've been keeping safe from yourself, from the possibility of failure, from the vulnerability of actually trying and actually being seen? Because there is something in there, there always is. Something tender, something that was once hurt in a specific way, something that learned from that specific hurt, that it was safer to wait, to explain, to keep the conditions just a little bit not right, that something doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be seen. I'm not going to tell you to dismantle the story tonight. That's not how this works. A story built over years, from real experiences to protect something real, it doesn't come apart because someone said it should. But there is one question I want to leave with you. Not a task, not an instruction, not just this. The next time the story arrives, the reasonable, self-aware, carefully assembled explanation for why the timing still isn't right before you settle into it. Ask it one question. What are you protecting me from? Not whether it's true, not whether the circumstances are real. Just, what does believing this allow me to avoid? Sit with what surfaces. Don't fix it, don't explain it. Don't reach for another layer of story, just look at it. Because a shelter, seen clearly for what it is already less than a prison. The story isn't the enemy. It was the best you could do with what you had at the time you built it. But you have more now, and you've been living in a shelter you outgrew a long time ago. If this reached you in some way, stay close. Subscribe. We're in this together.